This bench planer is probably 100 years old. It belonged to my great-grandfather. And today I want to make it look a lot better and hopefully functional. I'm Travis and this is how I do things, and today I'm going to show you how I restore an antique bench planer. But first I got to figure out how to get this thing apart. It also has 100 years of rust on it. So I'm going to take some PB Blaster and soak this thing thoroughly and then come back in a couple hours. It's been sitting for a couple of hours now, and now I'm going to try, emphasis on try, to take it all apart again. But before I do that, I always like to snap a couple of detailed photos just to make sure I can put it all back together again. Well, I just screwed up big time and I broke part of this screw off. So at this point, I have no idea how I'm going to get that screw out, and then whether or not I can find something that looks kind of like that as a replacement. So that's kind of a bummer. So I'm gonna let those two screws soak a little longer in PB Blaster and think about what I'm gonna do next. So while I'm thinking about what I'm going to do with that, I'm going to attach some sandpaper to my bench top, which is relatively flat, using CA glue and masking tape. This trick is really cool because it allows you to attach something to a surface, yet still be able to remove it later. I'll be using 120, 220, and 400 grit sandpaper. Also just realized that this screw will not come out, so again, more PB Blaster and time in this case. Just gonna let it sit and just do its thing so I don't break this screw as well. And while that's all happening, I'm gonna take some of these other pieces I could get apart and start cleaning them up with a combination of the sandpaper and a wire brush. Time for a little more PB Blaster on these parts. This thing needs a lot of work, so even though I still can't get those screws out, I'm going to start working on flattening the bottom and the sides. It's actually cleaning up quicker than I thought. Alright, so I got the bottom mostly flat using the 120 grit. I still need to work through the other grits, but now I'm going to work on the sides before I do that. I'm sure you're asking the same thing I'm asking right now, which is why in the heck am I putting in this much effort on this old antique tool? I could go buy a new tool. Well, when you ever met your great-grandpa, this is the closest thing you're ever going to get to meeting him and being with your great-grandpa. So I cherish tools like this. Even if I never use them, it's just so cool to remember where you came from. And there's no better way to remember where you came from than restoring an old tool from your great-grandpa. Well, as I said before, the paint is in very rough shape on this bench plane, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the 220, and then after I get these screws out and I paint it, I'll finish it. And that is starting to look pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and set this aside and work on some of the other pieces some more. Also, more PB Blaster. Now for this step, I'm going to use just a piece of sandpaper to try and get some of these less flat edges. Well, on this part, that's about as far as I can go with sandpaper. On this back side, there's a lot of as-cast features, which are kind of rough anyway, so all I'm going to do with that is a wire brush and some WD-40. Well, that part turned out pretty good. I'm fairly happy with that. When I first started working on it, I couldn't even move this mechanism. That's how messed up it was. So I'm going to go ahead and set that piece aside. And then I'm going to grab some of these other parts and I'm going to chuck those up in a drill so I can clean them up real fast. But before I do that, I'm going to check to see if any of my screws loosened up. More PB Blaster. So the idea here is going to be to chuck some of these pieces up in a drill and then spin them and clean them with WD-40 a wire brush, and sandpaper. After a few days of soaking in PB Blaster, I got lucky and was able to remove this screw with some channel locks. However, I have not been so lucky with these screws. I think I'm going to need to go to more drastic measures. I think what I'm going to do is just break the heads off of these screws so I can get the two pieces apart and then see if I can get the rest of the threads out. Oh, what? Oh my God. I don't know if you guys just realized what just happened there, but as I was beating the crap out of these screws trying to break them, they didn't break. But what they did do is they stretched and loosened up, and I was able to actually just turn them out with a screwdriver. So that was an amazing result that I did not expect. So now I don't have to mess with the screws. I just need to find some new screws that look kind of old to match this bench plane. Let's move on. So now this whole thing got a lot simpler. All I need to do now is finish cleaning up the rest of these parts with sandpaper and a wire brush, and then I can go ahead and sharpen this blade and put it all back together. Just like the other parts, I'm going to be using the wire brush, and anything that looks like it might have been S-cast or threads, I'm going to be using sandpaper, anything that looks like it was intended to be machined and flat. While I would absolutely love to get this little pin out so I can get this little mechanism off so I can make this perfectly flat, I'm not going to do that. I don't think the pin's going to survive, and I don't think I'd be able to find a good replacement. So I'm going to do my best to clean up this surface without making it perfectly flat. Maybe I can work a little bit on the edge of the table, so we'll see what we can do. As I'm cleaning up these parts, I like to just use plain old WD-40. I think that piece looks pretty good for now. Later on, we're going to end up painting this, and then I'll clean up these surfaces one last time. Now let's move on to the base. Later on, I'm going to be protecting these parts with some Odie's oil and a Scotch-Brite pad. Check out these wood shavings and stuff. These are probably from some project that my great-grandpa was working on about 100 years ago. Now that I've got this mostly cleaned up, it's pretty easy to see which surfaces are supposed to be painted and which ones are supposed to be machined. So I'll remember that later. So I'm going to clean up those machine surfaces the best I can, and then I'll make sure I mask those off later before I start painting. I've decided I'm happy enough with those results, so now that I got the blade all disassembled, I'm going to move on to that. Well, after a ton of sanding on the 120, you can see I still have a lot of these pits that I'm not going to be able to get out. I'm okay with that because this is a vintage bench planer, and a little patina I think adds a little more character. So I'm going to move on to the 220. So overall, considering how this blade looked before, I'm actually quite happy with this. So now I'm going to go ahead and sharpen this blade. I'm not going to give you a lot of information on that because I am not the best sharpener in the world, but there's a lot of other great YouTube videos out there that can help you with that. But I will leave you a link to some of the tools that I'm going to be using to sharpen this blade in case you want to get some for yourself. So after a lot of work, I got this blade to a point where I think it's very usable and very sharp. Now we can move on to painting these parts. To paint these parts, I'm going to clean them with some alcohol just to remove some of the excess WD-40 and dirt. And then I'm going to mask some of these surfaces off so I don't get too much paint on them. And then I'm gonna paint the part and then remove the masking tape and then sand the surfaces one more time just to remove any overspray that might be there. And while the paint was drying, I figured it'd be a good time to sand down some of these wood pieces. As I'm doing this, again, I just can't help but think about how my great-grandpa touched these with his hands. Somebody that I never met. I think that that's just the coolest thing in the world. There's also a neat defect kind of here in the end where it looks like my great-grandpa dropped it or something, and he tried to repair it. You can even see a teeny tiny little screw hole where he screwed the old piece back on. So I'm actually going to leave that exactly that way just so I can think of him whenever I see it. The paint is all dry and my paint job turned out good enough. So now I can take the masking tape off and see how much paint I need to clean up. Overall, not too bad. The rest of the paint I can just remove with some sandpaper. I'll also be doing the final cleanup on all these surfaces during this time. I'm almost ready to start assembling my bench plane, but before I do, I'm going to protect both the metal and the wood with some Odie's oil. The Odie's oil is super easy to apply. You just rub it in with a Scotch-Brite pad and then wipe it off. And it should do a good job of preventing that rust from coming back. Does anybody know what kind of wood this is, by the way? If you do, please leave a comment. Keen viewers will notice that I've gotten a haircut since the last time you saw me. Well, that's because it's been a couple of days. You remember when I destroyed these screws earlier in the video trying to get them out? Well, it turns out they're really hard to find at the hardware store. In fact, I couldn't find anything with those threads. So I needed a few days to figure that out. So I found these. They came from a plane about the same year, so I think they're a pretty good replacement. And they sure as heck are a lot better than these stainless steel monstrosities. So that being said, I think I can finally assemble this plane. Let's do it. While I was assembling the plane, I decided to use a little bit of white lithium grease on all the threads just to make sure they won't seize up later. I ended up finding the frog adjustment screws on eBay. I knew the length was correct based off the item description, but I wasn't sure about the threads, so I took a bit of a gamble, and it paid off. I would have asked the seller what the threads were on these screws, but to be honest, I didn't know what they were supposed to be. It took a lot of fidgeting and adjustment to get this thing right. Again, it is amazing how many things you learn about a tool when you're restoring it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And also leave me a comment. Let me know what I did wrong or did right. And if you're done doing all those things, check out one of these other awesome videos up here, and I'll see you guys in the next video.